Okay, let's read from Revelation chapter 8. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer, with the prayers of all God's people, on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in mid-air call out in a loud voice, "Woe! Woe! Woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other 3 angels." God bless the reading of his word.
Well, it's very nice to be here, and thanks for the welcome and the invitation. Nice to see old colleagues, old friends, but to be honest, it's just nice to get to London for 24 hours, so thanks for that. I want to draw your attention this morning, for the time we have, to a little phrase which James read, and it's found in Revelation chapter 8, and it's verse 1, and it says, "There was silence in heaven for about half an hour." There was silence in heaven for about half an hour. I want to look at this little phrase this morning in the context of those verses to show us the importance, the power, and the privilege of prayer. Before we do that, I need to spend some time putting this in the context of Revelation, because Revelation is a book which polarizes Christians. Some Christians are obsessed with the book of Revelation, and they spend all their time reading Revelation, and they've come up with all sorts of conspiracy theories. They've found every historical character in the book of Revelation. So they found Boris Johnson, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair. I will let you work out in which guise they have found them, but they found them, okay? And even as a school teacher in London, when we opened the school and we introduced biometrics, we have to put your finger on something to get your photocopying your food. A woman phoned me and said, "Mr. Ebenezer, my son can't do that because," and I said, "Why?" "Because it tells me in the book of Revelation." Okay? So you can find all sorts of things in the book of Revelation. People are obsessed with it. Other Christians are petrified of it, and they never go near it. They think that it's confusing, it's full of puzzling symbols, so they never bother. I would argue that both approaches are equally wrong. And so this morning, before I come to my little text, I am going to spend a bit of time, but don't worry, this is probably the longest part of the sermon, okay, putting this in the context of Revelation. And I would actually say that Revelation, even though it appears to be a very difficult book, full of puzzling symbols, actually, to understand it, we need to know some things. We need to know that Revelation is 3 things, 7 sections, 2 halves, 4 approaches, 1 genre. If you understand that, you've got your grasp of Revelation. is three things. Number one, Revelation is a letter. Okay? So if you look at Revelation chapter 1 and verse 4, it says, John to the 7 churches that are in Asia. If you look at Revelation chapter 1 verse 11, it says, write what you see in a book and send to the 7 churches. So this book, Revelation, is first and foremost a letter. It was written to 7 churches in Asia Minor at the end of the 1st century. And John is writing it, and he wants them to know that God sees them. He sees their tears. He wants them to know that their prayers, and this is what we're going to come to this morning in a bit of depth, their prayers are influential in world affairs. He wants them to know that the death of their fellow Christians, because lots of them were being persecuted, was precious in his sight. He wants them to know that they had a final victory in the Lord Jesus Christ. That the Lord Jesus Christ lives and reigns and governs the church, or governs the world, I should say, in the interest of his church. And this Jesus Christ is coming back, and he's with them now. So Revelation is a letter to these little churches, 7 of them, Smyrna, Ephesus, Pergamum, Laodicea, 7 churches in Asia Minor. This man is writing a letter to them. Now, it's also a prophecy. Because if Revelation was just a letter written to 7 churches in Asia Minor at the end of the 1st century, it would be quite interesting if you like history, but it'd be pretty irrelevant for us in tradition in the 21st century. But it's a prophecy. And so if you look at Revelation chapter 1 verse 3, it says, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. And if you turn to Revelation chapter 22, and you see in verse 10, it says, and he said to me, do not seal up the words of this prophecy. Again in verse 18, I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy. Again in verse 19, and if anyone takes away from the words in the book of this prophecy, it's a prophecy. So this is the interesting bit. This letter, written to 7 specific churches at the end of the 1st century, because it's a prophecy, it is written to us in Llanelli Evangelical Church as much as it ever was written to Smyrna, Pergamum, Laodicea. So what we are reading and discussing this morning is God's letter to us. It's a prophecy. And the third thing it is a revelation. That's probably the most important thing it is. God opens the curtains of heaven and reveals things to us. John, the apostle, was on this island. It was a prison island. He'd been sent there because of his faith in Jesus Christ. It's the Lord's Day. He's probably feeling a bit down in the dumps. He's worried about the church. He hasn't seen Jesus Christ for 60 years. And yet God says to him on this particular Sunday, I'm opening the curtains, John. And I'm showing you how things really are. And this morning, that's what we're going to do. What's Revelation? It's 3 things. It's a letter, it's a prophecy, it's a revelation. It's got 7 sections. 7 sections. Pay attention, I'm going to test you at the end. I'm a school teacher, alright? 7 sections. The first section, chapter 1, 2 and 3. The Lord Jesus Christ in the midst of his church. That's the first 3 chapters of the book. These 7 churches, you've got a word for each one of them, and Jesus Christ in the middle. The second section, you've got a throne, chapter 4 to 7. You've got a throne and 7 seals. And so John sees into heaven, and he sees actually above this world there's a throne which governs everything. And there's 7 seals. And the 7 seals are really the history of the world. From the beginning right to the end. And you can read it yourself, but in chapter 4 to 7 you will see things like wars will come, persecution will come, disease will come, famine will come. It's the history of the world. So the first section, Christ among his church. The second section, a throne and the whole of human history. The third section, which is what we're going to look at this morning, you've got 7 trumpets. And they are really warnings, judgments, So God is saying throughout history there will be judgments. The fourth section, you've got a woman, a child and a dragon. The woman is the church. The dragon is the devil. The child is Jesus Christ. The dragon goes after the child, fails. So he puts all his anger and all his kind of fierceness against the church. That's what happens, isn't it? So, Jesus Christ among his church, the history of the world unfolding, characterized by judgments, and yet you've got Jesus Christ in heaven, but the devil out to get his church. The fifth section, 7 bowls. So whereas the trumpets are the warnings of God, the 7 bowls are these judgments being poured out on people. The sixth section, you've got the fall of Babylon. One day, this world, Cardiff, London, will fall. The thinking of human beings, the pleasures, the persecution will all come to an end. Because the 7th section of Revelation is the final consummation, when Jesus Christ will come back and take his church to himself. They are the 7 sections. Now the book's in 2 halves. Remember I said 3 things, 7 sections, 2 halves. The 2 halves are this. The first half of the book is all about what's happening on earth. The second half of the book is actually saying what's happening on earth isn't really what's happening. There are things going on behind the scenes, in the heavenlies. So if you read Ephesians, it says we don't battle against flesh and blood. There's cosmic powers, spiritual force of evil in the heavenly places. 3 things, 7 sections, 2 halves, 4 approaches. How do we understand Revelation? If you were to pick up Revelation this morning, I'm pretty sure, I know you're a very intelligent bunch, but, well, maybe not Steve, but the rest of you are quite an intelligent bunch, alright? But if you were to read Revelation, it is confusing. And there are parts of the Bible, if you read Genesis, and if you read maybe Joshua and Judges and Kings, they are historical books. This is a different type of book. So how should we approach it? Some people say, well, do you know what? It was written to 7 churches, and it's about what happened back then. And it was a message to the persecuted church at the end of the 1st century. Well, maybe it was, but it wouldn't be very relevant to us today. Other people say, no, it's all about the end. Well, that might give us hope, but it doesn't help me tomorrow when I go to work. It doesn't help with my family. Other people say, well, no, it charts human history. So the 7 churches are 7 stages in church history. So it's not really legacy, that's just a stage. Well, the problem with that is you can't bring anything down to like history and the world, and it's not tangible. And other people say, well, no, it's all, the 4th thing is it's just principles. I would argue that to understand Revelation, we have to adopt all 4 approaches. So what was written to the early church? It is relevant for the end. It is principles we can get. And if we take all 4 approaches, we understand Revelation. 3 things, 7 sections, 2 halves, 4 approaches. Finally, before we come to the text, 1 genre. It's very symbolic. It's called apocalyptic. Okay, so we mustn't press the details too hard. We mustn't try and work out every little thing. It's a picture, and the more we read it, the more the picture builds. Because those 7 sections are actually parallel sections. Who's heard of VAR? Anyone heard of VAR? You must have heard of VAR. Only James Polarizes has heard of VAR. If you watch football, who's heard of football? Brilliant. 4 people heard of football, 1 person heard of VAR. VAR, if I watch the football, now just imagine Harry Kane scores a goal. We have to check, was he offside? So they get all these cameras in the ground to look at the same incident from lots and lots of different angles. These 7 sections in Revelation, all the same thing from different angles. So the 7 seals, this is important what we're going to come to now, the 7 seals are history. What is happening? The 7 trumpets are judgments. What's happening in history? The 7 bowls, these judgments being poured out. It's all the same thing, just looked at from different angles. Now, very big introduction. We'll go more quickly now. 3 things to say about this particular verse in the context of Revelation. It's very important now as we come to this verse in Revelation that you keep those things in the back of your mind about this book. When we look at this little phrase then in Revelation chapter 8 verse 1, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. It's not literal, but it's given us a really, really awesome picture. And it teaches us three things about prayer. There was silence in heaven for about half an hour. The first thing it teaches us is this. Prayer is an awesome responsibility. We come to the part of the book which is talking now about the 7 seals, and the 7th seal is opened. History. When the 7th seal is opened, it unveils 7 trumpeters. Please don't think like a brass band. It's not that. It's like a horn. Now you know and I know, a horn is to warn people. Okay, so if I'm driving and somebody swerves in front of me, I hit my horn to warn them. Okay, or if I'm driving along the road and a young child runs out in front of my car, I toot the horn to warn them. So this, in heaven, there is silence for about half an hour when the 7th seal, history is opened, and revealed are these 7 trumpeters, 7 horns, 7 warnings. And you can see in verse 6, the angels are about to blow these horns, and heaven falls silent. These horns are the judgments of God. And when they're about to send these judgments out, the whole of heaven falls silent. Now, I don't know what Cardiff's like now, I haven't been here for a while, but if it's anything in London, which I'm sure it is, everyone's got an opinion on God. Everyone has. And everyone thinks that they know better than God. I remember when I was in university in Aberystwyth, and we did door to door, and I remember knocking on the girl's door and said, I'm from the Christian Union and we've got a mission, would you like to come? And she said to me, I can't wait to see God, she said. I can't wait to see him. She said, because when I see him, I've got a few things I'm going to say to him. I don't know if you know Stephen Fry, a very intelligent man. I think he's got something like 12 million followers on Twitter. He's a very influential, powerful, people love Stephen Fry. He hates God. This is what he said. He said, bone cancer in children, how dare he? How dare he? People starving in Africa, how dare he? If he exists, when I see him, I'm going to tell him. Can I say this to you? When you and I, one day, and listen now from the youngest person here all the way through, one day, all of us in this room will meet this God. And when we meet him, we will be silent. Silent. Because when we see his power and his majesty and his judgment, we will be silent. The 7, we can't have got time to go through it, but you can see the 7 trumpets. It's from verse 7 in chapter 8 to chapter 9 verse 21, and then a bit in 11 verse 15. It tells you what these 7 judgments are. And they're very similar to the plagues in Egypt. If you remember when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and God was trying to persuade the Pharaoh to change his mind, he sent plagues, warnings, trumpets. Change your mind, Pharaoh. Change your mind. And so he sent these judgments so that Pharaoh would change. The same thing happens today. Why do things happen in the world today? I would say that, as C.S. Lewis said, warnings, famines, wars, pandemics, what are they? They are God's trumpets to warn people. We are not the captains of our soul. We are not the master of our fate. So when the angels and the heavens saw these warnings and judgments, they fell silent. Can I say to you this morning, if you're not a Christian, I don't know most of you here, so listen to me very carefully now, if you're not a Christian. Everything that's happened in Britain over the last 18 months, whatever you think of it, You have to think this, don't you? It has shown us we are not in control. Boris Johnson, I don't know what you think about Boris Johnson, please don't tell me, but Boris Johnson in January 2020 said this. I got a feeling, he said, this is going to be a great year for Britain. Why? He didn't know. And suddenly, all the plans, I was talking to Rico Tice last Friday, he said, do you know what? He said, when I look in my diary, it tells me all the time I am not in control. I've had to cancel everything. We're not in control. There's a God. He's in control. And he sends things and we can't do anything about it. And all these things are just little pictures. Listen carefully to me. Little pictures of a final judgment. And if you're not a Christian this morning, you will meet this great God. You will fall silent before him. And you've got heaven and hell in front of you. If you're not a Christian this morning, make your peace with God today. Because he is awesome. But why does this tell us that prayer is an awesome responsibility? Because we need to pray about these things. As a church, on a Thursday night, you meet 8:30. Is that right, James? Got that right. You meet to pray. Pray for these things. Pray that Llanishen and Cardiff will read the Times. Pray for your families who are still not Christians. Pray for the young people in this locality. Pray for the families. Pray for the deprivation. Pray for the gangs in the city. Pray for all of them. The people you work with. Members of your family not saved. Neighbours. Pray that they would see these things, these trumpets of God, and they will respond to them. This verse teaches us the fact that heaven falls silent. It teaches us that prayer is an awesome responsibility. And prayer is the most important thing. People say to me, we need to pray for the work. We need to pray for the work. I would argue this. Prayer is the work. In Acts chapter 6 verse 4, this is what the apostle said. We will reserve our best energies, our very bodily resources for prayer. Prayer is the work. You know, do you remember when in Exodus when Israel fought against the Amalekites? Moses was the leader. He did a very strange thing for a leader. He leaves the battlefield and he hands over to young Joshua. And him, Aaron and Hur, they climb the nearest mountain and they lift their arms to God in prayer. And when they prayed, Israel prevailed. When they didn't pray, Israel failed. And they learnt a very important lesson that day, that the real battle is prayer. How do you measure the strength of a church? By its prayer meetings. The Puritans used to say it's the engine room of the church. In 1905, revival came to Charlotte Chapel in Edinburgh. And 2 years later, the church was still full experience of revival. And Joseph Kemp said this: if ever you should be asked of the secret of the church's great spiritual prosperity, tell them about the prayer meetings. How are you going to impact Llanishen? How will you see your family and friends saved? How can we, look at us, I don't know you, but you look a bit like me, we're just ordinary people. If the good and the great come in you this morning, there's nothing to fear in you. How are we going to pull down strongholds? How are we going to turn this city upside down again? I was speaking last night in a centre for ex-offenders, alright? And the lady who runs it, she's a legend. She's met the likes of Nicky Cruz and Doreen Irvine. And how can we get those things to happen again? Drug addicts and gang members and people into witchcraft. How can we get them saved again? We can't do it, alright? We've got an awesome responsibility to plead with that throne and say, God, do it again. We've sang about this, won't we? If that's true, let's pray to him. An awesome responsibility. My second point is this. We have an audience with God. Heaven falls silent for half an hour. because the judgment of God is awesome. But it also falls silent because people pray to God and they have an audience with Him. I don't know what you think about prayer meetings. I'll be honest with you, okay? I've sat in prayer meetings. James said I've been to the Heath. I've sat in prayer meetings in the Heath and I've been bored. Okay? And when I come from work on a Wednesday night and I think, it's a prayer meeting tonight. And I've been in prayer meeting, and in the Heath it used to finish at 9 o'clock, and at 3 minutes to 9, you were praying. Please have no one else to pray now. And Mr. Hyam, come on, can you finish it off, please? And then someone gets up at 2 minutes to 9, and they pray for a quarter of an hour, and you're losing the will to live. And prayers are dry and hard. That's what we think of prayer. Do you know what's happening in heaven? They're silent. It's like God says to the hosts of heaven, shh, my people are praying. Son in heaven. You know, if you ask my wife, she will tell you a list of things that really irritate her about me. Okay? I know you find that hard to believe, but that's true, right? Lots of things irritated about me. I would say pretty close to the top is this. When she's talking to me, and I'm still checking my emails on my laptop, or I'm looking at my phone, it drives her mad, because I'm distracted. I'm not giving her my full attention. Can I say this to you reverently? At 8:30 this Thursday, when this church meets to pray, it's like God puts his laptop down. He switches his phone off. He leans forward on his throne, and he says to all those in heaven, shh, Lanish shouldn't pray into me now. I need to listen. I need to listen. So we might find it hard and boring. But in heaven they're listening intently. See, John Calvin said this: nothing is adapted better to excite us to pray than a full conviction that we shall be heard. Every time you've prayed, God's listened. Every time this church has gathered together to pray, God's listened. Heaven goes silent. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, you've got this prayer of this relatively obscure woman in the hill country of Ephraim. But it matters to the Yahweh of hosts. He's the cosmic ruler, the sovereign of every and all power, and he quietens heaven to listen and answer her prayer. So when you pray, people you pray about, your situation, you young people going to school, you pray about what's going to happen. He listens. He silences heaven. The psalmist says he puts our tears in a bottle. And prayer changes things. God, through prayer, makes us participants in governing his world. I don't know about you. We go to a church in Twickenham. We meet on a Wednesday night to pray. And we meet for an hour and a half. I sometimes think God must think at 9:15. Is that it? Is that it? We've got the undivided attention of the master of the universe, the God of heaven and earth, and that's it. My bad ear and your bad back, that's it. Shouldn't we be a salt in heaven for our neighbours and our friends and our church and our government? And give him no rest till we know he's listened. It's an awesome responsibility. We've got an audience with God. And finally, as I close, we've got an advocate in heaven. I imagine you say this: it's great heaven silent. I can see there's so much to do. There's a judgment to come. The world's in a mess. It's an awesome responsibility. It's amazing I've got an audience with God, that he quietens heaven to listen to me. But you don't know what I'm like. I'm dirty. I'm sinful. I forget to read my Bible. My prayer life is terrible. My witness in school and work is awful. You don't know what I'm like. How can I talk to God? Well, do you know what? Because we have an advocate in heaven. If you look at verse 3, it says, and another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. It's a picture of these prayers being made acceptable to God. Let me ask you a question, it's a rhetorical question. What is Jesus Christ doing this morning? 2,000 years ago, he died on a cross. He died on a cross, and it was a once and for all sacrifice for sin. He was arrested, they stripped him naked, they beat him up, they put a blindfold on his eyes, they punched him and spat at him and hit him, and they said to each other, guess who did that? They just, you'd say in school, they dissed him. They pulled his beard, they cleared their throat and spat in his face. They whipped him 39 times, they tied his hands behind his back, to a pole in the praetorium, and they lashed him 39 times. That alone kills a lot of people. All his inner organs were on show. And then they took him with a cross. He walked the long way through the streets of Jerusalem, and he was so tired and so weary that he collapsed with exhaustion. He's the master of heaven and earth. He couldn't walk. He couldn't put one foot in front of the other. Someone had to help him carry his cross. And then he went to this cross, this rubbish tip outside Jerusalem. They nailed him. People laughed at him and mocked him and made fun of him, and then he went dark for 3 hours. And he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even God turned his back on him. Why? Because all the sins that you and I commit, the dirty thoughts, the things I've looked at I shouldn't have, the things I've said, the big sins I've fallen into, were all laid on him. Amazing. What's he doing this morning? That's a once and for all sacrifice. But what's he doing this morning? When I pray to God, Jesus Christ is at his side, pointing to what he did on Calvary. He said, you listen to him because of what I did. He keeps pointing to that cross. Now, when I pray, he makes those prayers acceptable. We had a minister came to Heath many years ago. He told a great story about his niece, whose mother was really ill. And the little girl went to the garden and she picked a bunch of flowers for the mother. It wasn't a bunch of flowers though. It was basically a clump of mud with some flowers mixed in with weeds and thistles. The gesture was great. And then the uncle, not to, pour cold water on this lovely little gesture, he spent time with the little girl, and they picked out all the thorns, and picked out all the mud, and picked out all the weeds, and presented a beautiful posy of flowers. When I pray this morning, my prayers go to heaven like a big clump of earth. When I pray, I come up with cliches and same old things. I get my theology mixed up. It's full of pride and sin. That's my sin going to heaven. But this man, Jesus Christ, he makes them acceptable to God. Charles Spurgeon said, I thank God my prayers go to heaven in the Revised Version. Yeah? Because God, the Lord Jesus Christ, makes them right in heaven. Pray to him. We've got an awesome responsibility. You can read in these verses, when the prayers go to heaven, it changes things. I come as a sinner. I go to this throne full of sin and shame and guilt. But my prayers, I come from that throne. I'm ransomed, healed, restored, forgiven. I go there as a backslider. He heals my backsliding. I take my family and my friends and this community and this church. I take who the next minister is going to be. I take it to him. I can leave it with him. Changes things. And don't worry about being poor, rubbish you. You've got an advocate. Following the Civil War, a dejected Confederate soldier was sitting on the grounds of the White House. And he repeatedly tried to see Abraham Lincoln, because he believed he'd been unjustly deprived of certain lands in the South following the war. Every time he tried to get into the White House, the big guards with the big bayonet guns would stand in front of him, and he couldn't get in. And he was outside the White House, sat on the bench, with his head in his hands, upset, didn't know what to do. A young boy walked past him and said, "Man, what's wrong?" So the man told the story. He said, come with me, come with me. So the young boy took him, they got to the gates, the guard stood back, they let him go through the gate. They walked all the way through the grounds of the White House, through the corridors, and finally they came to the great library in the White House. And in the corner was Abraham Lincoln. And the little boy said, Dad, this is my friend. He needs your help. Me in Llanishen this morning, I come to pray, and Jesus Christ says to God, Father, this is Ali. He needs your help. Help him. Help him. And he points it back across, saying, look what I've done for him. Help him. We have got an awesome responsibility. We've got an audience in heaven. And we've got an advocate with God. We've got to pray with him. You know, let me close with this. Do you know, this is a question for you. Who knows who Michael Fagan is? Anyone know who Michael Fagan is? Well, Michael Fagan was a man who in 1982 broke into Buckingham Palace twice. It's quite famous, alright? Broke in twice to Buckingham Palace and climbed up drain pipes and everything else. The second time he got in, he actually got into the Queen's bedroom. Alright, so the Queen's in bed and she wakes up and there's Michael Fagan. Now, incredible. This bloke who lives in this council estate in London gets into the Queen's bedroom. And royal commentators obviously were amazed by this. And they had two questions. The first was this: how did he get in? And the second question was, and what did they talk about? Well, apparently, he said this to him. Do you know what's going on out there? And if you do you care? Now, let me ask those two questions about prayer this morning. How can I, because we won't get into the Queen's bedroom, but I can get into the throne room of God. How do I get in? Through Jesus Christ. What are we going to talk about? Well, the new minister, this estate, Cardiff, this nation. We've got loads to talk about. My family, people who are not saved, my backsliding, me being a better Christian, the things I struggle with. I'm going to bring them all to him. And do you know what? He does know. And he does care. So pray. There is silence in heaven for half an hour when we pray. And if you are a sinner this morning, still in your sin, come to him this morning and ask him to forgive you. And you know, if we were to argue about theology this morning, alright, what we sing in church, what we wear in church, what we think about this, what we think about that, the devil doesn't give a stuff. He doesn't. Okay? We can argue about theology. The devil loves it when Christians argue about theology. But he trembles when he sees the weakest saint upon his knees. Amen.